Okay, thank you, Zoe. So welcome everybody. We're just a whole rush of people just as we're about to start. So we're just starting the meeting and welcome along to our third seminar in the International Barley Hub. My name is George Laurie and I am Vice Chairman of the International Barley Hub. I also am a Director of the James Hutton Institute, and my day job is Managing Director of Scottish Agronomy. And just to tie this on in all quite nicely, Scottish Agronomy are one of the biggest trials operators in Scotland for the RL and NL lists that Paul's going to be talking about. So variety selection is one of the subjects I understand really well within the Barley seminars there. Today is all about the barley variety selection. And it's as I say, one of three seminars, the third seminar of 12 that we're running throughout the year for the International Barley Hub. The International Barley Hub is all about connection and better research into barley. And as you know, that it is about setting up a hub at Dundee. We have now been able to secure £62 million from the Tay City deal to do that. But the Barley Hub is more than just a building. It's all about connecting stakeholders, and these seminars are really showing that we're going out there and putting out the message to stakeholders. So get on to the main part of the business today. Our main speaker is Paul Goslin. Paul has been with AHDB for a good number of years, and again, I knew Paul when I sat on the Research and KE Committee of AHDB, and Paul and I worked very closely together. Paul took over the management of the RL list last year, I think, Paul, or the end of 2019, beginning of 2020. Yep. So yeah. Paul's been had contact with the RL list, but is now managing the RL list. So I'm going to stop whittering on and hand you over to our main speaker today, who is Paul Goslin. The format is that Paul will do his talk and then we'll break for questions. Can I ask you to use the chat box for questions, and I will direct the questions to Paul and during the question time, and then we'll do a summing up at the end. So Paul, it's over to yourself.
Thank you, George. I shall just attempt to share my screen. You can see that. Can you all see that? Is that good?
Yeah, that's great, Paul. Thank you.
So thank you, George, for that introduction. Yeah, today I'm going to be talking about the recommendation system for varieties in the UK, and focusing obviously very much on barley varieties. So I'm going to start with a very small part about variety choice, what drives variety choice. I'm then going to talk about the national list and the recommended list systems, a little bit of history about those and about how the national list works. And most of my talk today, though, is going to be talking about how varieties get added to the recommended list. And I'll go into that in some detail. I'll then talk about some of the challenges that the recommended list system faces and some of the limitations that there are to the system. And then I've just got a slide at the end just to talk about where we might go in the future. So what drives a farmer's variety choice? Well, very obviously yield is important. You have to have enough yield at the end of the season to make a profit. And all of the things that being equal, farmers will tend to choose high yielding varieties. Pest and disease resistance is important and increasingly important as we lose chemistry, either due to regulation or due to resistance in pest and disease. We haven't as yet, I don't think, seen much of a shift in variety choice in barley, but certainly in wheat, we've seen a big shift towards more resistant varieties. And if we see more resistance issues in terms of pest and disease we'll see that shift in barley as well, I'm sure. Agronomic characteristics such as lodging are important, and grain quality is a big factor. Your grain quality needs to be good, otherwise you won't have a market for it at the end of the year. As we're talking about barley, the malting sector, brewing, distilling, and of course we've got animal feed. You need to have a local market to sell your grain into, and if your grain is still in variety in the south of England, you're probably going to struggle to sell it. Cost of seed can be a factor in some cases, and variety type. With winter barley, conventional versus hybrid, is an argument that kind of goes on. I'm not going to talk too much about those two at the end there. So there are a whole raft of things that a farmer will consider when choosing a variety, but how are they actually meant to find out which are the best varieties? What are the characteristics in terms of those things that they're actually looking at? Well, one place they could go to is the national list. Now, maybe some of you on here don't realise that for a variety to be sold legally in the UK, it has to be on the national list of varieties, not just crop varieties. The local begonias down at B&Q, they'll be on the national list as well. It covers all sorts of plants and seeds. In terms of crops, we're talking about bits of regulation, the seeds national list of varieties regulations 2001, if you're interested in that sort of thing. There are quite a lot of different bits of regulations around seeds and varieties, but that's the one that's pertinent to the national list. And the national list is published in the Plant Varieties and Seeds Gazette. That's published by DEFRA. It comes every month with changes to varieties, and then every 6 months or so they publish the full list for each of the different crops. Prior to Brexit, seed could also be sold legally in the UK if those seed were on the EU Common Catalogue of Varieties. Sadly now that's no longer possible due to Brexit. There were quite a lot of varieties transferred across from the EU Common Catalogue to the national list before Brexit, so at least some of those varieties could still be grown and sold in the UK. But why, you might ask, do we have a national list? And some people do question the need for a national list. I think there are two main reasons to have a national list. One is to protect the plant breeders, and one is to protect the growers. Because for a variety to be included on the national list, it must pass some tests. And one set of tests is to prove that it is distinct, uniform and stable, so-called DUS tests. And that's really to show that it is a true new variety. That protects the breeder from someone stealing their variety and sell it under another name. And it protects the grower from being sold a dud variety that's not stable and not going to produce the goods that they're expecting. The varieties must also show value for cultivation and use, so-called VCU testing, and that's about protecting the growers, about making sure the varieties that are on the national list don't have a significant weakness that's going to impact not only them but potentially other crops in the area. And the process of adding varieties to the national list looks a little bit like this. So the breeders do their stuff every year. They produce their breeding lines. The numbers will vary from crop to crop. This is probably a little bit high for barley, but several hundred lines a year will be produced. And they pick the best of those which they think might make a new variety, and they'll add them into national list year one DUS and VCU trials, maybe 60 to 80 varieties a year. At the end of that year, they'll look at the results and they'll pull the worst ones, the ones they know make variety from the system. Go to second year national list trialing, DUS and VCU again. And at the end of that year, some of the varieties will be pulled again by the breeders because they're not up to scratch, and the rest will go to a panel which assesses them to find out if they can pass DUS and VCU. Some will fail, either because they're not true, unique and stable varieties, or because they have a weakness of some sort, but the rest will be added to the national list. But the national list is to an extent an embarrassment of riches. If you're trying to use it to choose varieties, there are, as of 31st of May this year, there were 122 varieties of winter barley on the national list and 139 varieties of spring barley on the national list. And in 2020 alone, there were 8 new spring barley varieties and 18 new winter barleys added to the national list. And it's even more tricky than that. The national list data belongs to the owner of the variety. It's not public information. You can't access the national list data directly. So how does a farmer decide what to grow from that massive list of those massive lists of varieties? Where do they get independent information that's going to guide them through that maze of varieties? Well, unsurprisingly, the answer is the recommended list system, which is currently run by the HDB. And the recommended list provides that independent information on the performance of new varieties. It's very much about new varieties. It works by selecting the best of the new national list varieties, so the ones that come out of year 2 testing, and test them further. And the aim is to assist the industry to make informed decisions on variety performance, and not just the farmers, but also the processors, because the processors need to know that they're buying material of a good and consistent quality. And levy payers also consist of processors as well as farmers. But it's not only about choosing varieties, it's also about providing information to guide crop management. The recommended list contains information on disease resistance, pest resistance, agronomic characteristics, which gives them the information that growers need to manage their crops appropriately. And we produce new lists annually: winter and spring wheat, winter and spring barley, winter and spring oats, and winter oilseed rape. We also have described lists, as we call them, of winter rye, triticale, spring linseed, and oilseed rape. These lists are much smaller than the recommended list. There are far fewer trials behind them, and they're not designed to be recommending varieties. They just give some information on varieties which growers might actually be able to get hold of commercial seed for. And the recommended list system goes back a long way. The first recommended list was published in 1944 by the then National Institute of Agricultural Botany, who went on, of course, to become NIAB. And it was just a winter wheat list. There were no other crops on it. 16 varieties of winter wheat, with a narrative description only, giving information such as whether they're suitable for growing on fertile sites, heavy land, light land, and end-use characteristics such as bread making or biscuit making. With no yield data, no data at all, just this list of varieties with some general information about them. Back then, the average wheat yield was 2.6 tonnes per hectare, and the barley area was mostly malting barley in those days, was completely dominated by 2 varieties that, so some things were already starting to look a bit familiar. If we fast forward 30 years from then to 1975, 7 varieties of winter barley on the list by then, 18 varieties of spring barley. The lists were becoming much more extensive, starting to look a bit more like what we expect. We had data on yield now, standing power, shortness, earliness. Disease resistance was there, one scale, very familiar to what we have now. Interesting, we had winter hardiness for winter barley back then. That's since gone. And we also had latest safe sowing date for winter barley, and that's since gone. We don't provide information on either of those anymore. Interesting, the malting barley varieties were graded for their suitability for malting from 1 to 9. There was no indication of best end use, just a simple 1 to 9 quality of malting. 1,000 corn weight and specific weight were also included. So the list by 1975 was starting to look a bit more like what we recognise as the modern recommended list. Forward now to 2021, the list now belongs, the list is now run by HDB, I should say. In 2003, it passed from NIAB to HDB, or HGCA as it was in those days. And it's now a collaboration between 4 partners: ourselves, HDB, the British Society of Plant Breeders, BSPB, who obviously represent the interests of the plant breeders, the Maltsters Association of Great Britain, who obviously represent the maltsters, and the UK flour millers, until recently known as NABIM, obviously represent the flour millers. The cost of the whole programme, including cash and in-kind contribution, is approximately £5 million a year. And for HDB, it's easily the largest single project that we fund. And across all the crops, there are about 450 trials a year, with something over 800 varieties being trialled and over 40,000 trial plots. So it's a big project. So that's the list, the national list and the recommended list, and a little bit of history. How do we actually go about adding a variety onto the recommended list? Well, for barley, we've got 2 lists, winter and spring. For winter barley, we've got malting varieties, 2-row feed, 6-row feed, hybrid and conventional. There are only 1 conventional 6-row on the list at the moment. In spring barley, it's very much dominated, as you'd expect, by malting varieties, brewing, malt distilling, and grain distilling, with just a couple of varieties for feed on that spring barley list. And the recommended list system is governed by an RL project board. That project board has members from all the 4 parties, so ourselves, HGCA, BSPB, MAGB, and UK flour millers, and it has an independent chair that sits above that board. The board has the ultimate responsibility and the ultimate authority, but they delegate most of the decision making to 3 crop committees: an oilseeds, the wheat, and the barley and oat crop committee. They are technical committees who make the decisions, but our project board has the ultimate veto on those decisions. I have to say they don't veto decisions very often. The 3 crop committees have similar makeups, but the barley and oats committee looks like this. So there are 2 BSPB representatives, come from individual breeders, and they rotate every 3 years. We've got 2 farmers on there, 3 agronomists, a representative from Bodmer, the barley and oat millers, MAGB, SWRI, I'm sure most of you will know, the Scottish Whisky Research Institute. We've got 2 traders, one specialising in oats, one specialising in barley, and a crop pathologist. And it's just worth pointing out that AHDB staff members are not on the committee. We have no voting rights on the committee, and indeed there is a clause within the governing contract that says AHDB staff members must not comment on varieties. So if your favourite variety isn't on the recommended list, don't blame the AHDB staff. The trials are located in the areas which are most widely used for that particular crop. So that the map on the right is spring barley trials. Some of those sites will have more than one trial. As you can see, there's a concentration in Scotland, as you'd expect, with spring barley being such an important crop in Scotland. There's also concentration in East Anglia, where there's also a lot of malting barley grown. We have treated and untreated yield trials, often both at the same site, and we run inoculated disease trials as well, because we can't be sure that we'll get good disease data from untreated trials. Indeed, the last couple of years, the last 2 or 3 years, particularly in the spring trials, even our inoculated disease trials have struggled to get disease data out of, because the springs have been so dry and warm. We just haven't been able to get the diseases to take. I suspect this year we'll have plenty of disease data. We also run lodging trials, separate trials on lodging. And in barley, we have malting quality trials to produce samples for testing for malting quality, with different nitrogen regimes for those different trials, depending on what the end use is meant to be. And then, of course, we have feed trials, and they're run to just produce the highest yields possible, for no reason. The treated trials receive a robust fungicide and PGR program. So the winter barley trials receive a 4-spray program, although one of those is optional. And the spring barley has a 3-spray program, and again, one of those is optional. And those optional sprays are up to the judgment of the local trial manager, whether they believe that the disease pressure at the site that year, it requires that 4th spray. The RL does get criticised on a fairly frequent basis for using a very robust spray program, but the RL is not trying to establish replicate commercial practice. It's trying to establish the genetic potential of varieties. And this theory that we should switch to a more of a commercial fungicide regime has been debated at length on a number of occasions. The problem is, or one of the problems is, what is a commercial fungicide regime? If you're growing a winter barley crop, and there are winter barley trials on the map on the right, that your commercial fungicide program is going to be very different to a commercial fungicide program on a trial in the Cambridge area, or indeed in Scotland. So actually defining what is a commercial program is very difficult, because even 2 farms next to each other, depending on whether they're a high input, high output, or a lower input, lower output system, will have quite different fungicide regimes. So certainly for the foreseeable future, we'll be sticking to genetic potential, not trying to replicate commercial practice. All the trials are inspected by the AHDB field team. The field team are out today looking at cereal trials in the west of England. And the trials are often also visited by breeders. The breeders want to see how their varieties are doing compared to their competitors, and we'll take into account reports of trials from breeders as well. But every plot is scored for condition by the RL team. Last year was a little bit different with COVID, but the team is out as normal this year, and every single plot will be looked at and scored for condition. Trials may be abandoned at any point from establishment. If we get poor establishment, we can abandon a trial right at that point, right through to post-harvest. The trial may go all the way through to harvest, and then we reject the yield data at the end if the trial looks too variable and we can't explain what's going on. We can also abandon individual plots, remove them from the data set at the end, and that can be for if part of a trial is affected by flooding, for instance, or wheat. It might be something like take call affecting a trial in an area. So we will take individual plots, and up to around a third of the plots can come out of a trial, but that's a fairly extreme example. Then once we have the data, there's an element of data crunching going on. So the national and regional yields are calculating using a 5-year data set. The disease and agronomic traits are calculated on a 1 to 9 scale. And the chart on the bottom right shows how that's done. So we have a disease rating from 1 to 9, and a disease level across the bottom. For most traits, 9 equals 0, so 0 lodging, 0 disease is a 9, but the bottom point is variable depending on what we're talking about. So in one disease, a 1 might be 10% disease, in another disease it might be 50%. It depends on the disease, and that bottom fixed point is fixed using susceptible varieties or usually several susceptible varieties. Once you've set your fixed point at the top and your fixed point at the bottom, and all your other varieties will fall along that line and be rated accordingly. It's worth noting that for almost every trait, the scales are logarithmic. So a difference of 1 unit at a low rating is much larger than a difference of 1 unit at a high rating. And I think that's something that farmers and agronomists often don't appreciate. A difference right up here is between the 7 and 8 isn't actually making very much difference to the amount of disease or lodging. So once we have the data, we've got the trials, we've validated them, we've got the data, we've done the data crunching, then it's back to the committees. And what the committees are trying to do is identify new varieties which have a balance of features, and it is very much a balance of features. It's not one particular feature or 2 features, it's a balance of all the features that are sufficiently better than the existing varieties, such that they could potentially make a more economic return in the market. And not only do they have to do that, it's also the role of the committee to actually decide the types of varieties that are to be considered. So for instance, in barley, we have the different malting categories, and it's up to those categories and add new ones if they feel they need to. They also have to select the criteria to judge the varieties on, and I'll spend a bit of time talking about the criteria in a moment, and decide the relative importance of those criteria, because obviously some things are more important when you're selecting varieties than others. And then they have to decide which varieties to judge them again. As I said at the top, they have to judge the new varieties against the existing varieties, but which actual ones do you judge them against? Now, this is one of those tables where normally in a presentation you'd say it doesn't matter about the detail. The detail does matter here, so I'm hoping you can see at least some of it. This is a table from for this year for winter barley variety selection criteria. I'm going to spend a little bit of time just on this table, so hopefully you can see it reasonably well. So down the left-hand side, we've got in the left-hand column, we've got the different criteria that we judge the varieties on. So we've got some yield criteria. We've got at the top, we've got malting assessments, specific weight screening, so grain quality. We've then got regional yields, agronomic features such as ripening, brackling. We've then got disease characteristics, and then we've got at the bottom we've got different soil yields. Then in the next few columns we've got our minimum standards and target specifications. Minimum standards apply only to diseases, and they're designed to stop varieties getting on that could present a threat not only to the crop being grown but potentially to neighbouring crops. We have a target specification for lodging in winter barley of 4. It is possible for varieties to be recommended if they're below a target specification, but they'd have to be quite exceptional in some of their areas to do that. Then across the top, what we have is our candidate selection and our recommendation. So these are candidates coming out of the national list system. We're going to recommended list trials, and then we have our recommendation at the end. And what we have in the bulk of the table is how important we rate these different characteristics for these different for the selection. And we have the different markets here. This is winter barley, so we've got brewing, 2-row feed, 6-row feed, and 6-row hybrid feed. And you can see we're going from low importance near the bottom for yield on different soil types and height without PGR, medium to high. Then we have some very high importance characteristics of Rhynchosporium and net blotch. And for most of the categories, the importance is the same for the different market segments. The exceptions are things like Rhynchosporium and net blotch, which are rated very high for the feed varieties, but for the malting varieties, they're only recommended as high. Because if we're talking about malting varieties, then actually the malting qualities are more important than necessarily the agronomic and the disease characteristics. So the committee will weigh up these different categories across the new varieties and see whether a variety should be recommended. We also have yield targets. Yield targets are set at 2% above the average or 3% for the winter feed market of the top yielding varieties on the market and in that particular segment of the market. And we order the varieties in yield, UK ranked yield. Then anything that's more than 2% above our yield target, which is this average of the best ones, will get automatically selected for recommendation, but only if it meets those minimum standards and target specifications. If it doesn't, then it has to be reviewed. Varieties that are above the yield target by less than the 2% or 3% automatic threshold will be reviewed by the committee, but the expectation for those varieties that they will be recommended unless they have a weakness. Once we fall below the yield target, then it will be reviewed by the committee, but for it to be recommended, we have to find strengths. And once we fall more than 2% below the yield target, then a variety would have to have exceptional strengths to get recommended. You might be asking exceptional strengths against what? Well, it's exceptional strengths or weaknesses indeed compared with the comparator varieties. So what are the comparator varieties? Well, comparator varieties I like to call them gatekeepers to the recommended list. Because if yield isn't high enough to get automatic selection, then a new variety must show a positive balance of features compared with the comparator varieties in order to be recommended. Comparative varieties shows if they're good agronomic, grain quality, and disease resistant characteristics. So it's not about yield, it's about all those other characteristics that I showed you a moment ago. And just as an example, for this year, 2021, the committee will be comparing the spring malting barley brewing varieties against RGT Planet and Laureate, and the 6-row hybrids they'll be comparing against SY Kings Barn and SY Thunderbolt. And those comparators are reviewed every year and they change fairly regularly. I just want to spend a little bit of time on this DEX table, just showing you how those comparators work, because I think it is quite important to understand that. So this is fake data. The table is the characteristics from winter barley, and the levels of importance are correct, but the data in the table is fake. I just made it up. So we've got a theoretical comparator A and theoretical comparator B, a new variety X and a new variety Y. And our yield target for the UK is 104% in this example. And if we look at new variety X, its UK treated yield is 105%. So it's above the yield target we'd expect to recommend this variety. So the committee will then look at it, and they'll start at the top usually, or sometimes they start at the highest importance categories, but we'll start at the top for this purpose of this. We look at grain quality, the specific weight and screenings, and you'll see the specific weight is about the same as comparator B, better than comparator A, and its screenings are better than both the comparators. So variety X has got good grain quality. However, its UK untreated yield is not great. It's below our two comparators. This starts to look like a weakness. We are starting looking for weaknesses because it's above the yield target. Drop down a couple more to the next box. We can see our ripening is +2. That means it's 2 days later than our control, and that's later than both the comparators. So again, it's starting to look like a bit of a weakness in this variety. If we drop down to the big box further down, Here we get our disease ratings. If we look at the mildew rating, it's got a 3. That's worse than both the comparators and quite a lot worse than the comparators. Brown rust is worse than both the comparators. It's got a good Rinkesporium score, which is of very high importance, but its net blight score is worse than both the comparators, and that's a very high importance. So this variety, it's got decent grain quality, but it's going to be let down on its disease, it's going to be let down on its ripening. I would not expect this variety to get recommended, even though it's above the yield target. Variety Y, slightly different sort of variety. Its grain quality is it's in between the two comparators. So it kind of sits somewhere in the middle there, nothing special. It's below the yield target. So we're looking for strengths here, not weakness. This variety has to have a strength or balance of features of strength to get on the list. If you look at its UK untreated yield, it's better than both the comparators. So I can see maybe a strength here. Its ripening is better than one of the comparators, equal to the other. And if we drop down to the disease, its mildew is about the same as the comparators, but it's got high brown rust score, very high Rinkesporium score, and a high net blight score, higher than both comparators. So despite the fact this variety is below the yield target, we have found some strengths in it. It's got good untreated yield, it's got good disease resistance, it's fairly early, so this is a variety I would expect to probably get recommended were it a real variety. But of course, talking about barley, so barley, malting barley is more than just about yield and disease, and we see that in the varieties that are grown, with things like Golden Promise and Maris Otter still being grown widely. So we test varieties that are potentially going to go for malting. We test them ourselves in micro malting tests, and the MBC and Malting Barley Committee also test them to see what their qualities are like. Varieties that appear to be suitable go on to macro scale testing, and they can be added to the RL as provisionally approved if the MBC give them the green light. But only those that have provided evidence of satisfactory commercial scale performance in malting, brewing or distilling will achieve full approval both by the MBC and on the RL. Varieties may be technically perfectly good, but if they're not picked up by the industry and malted, then they won't receive that full approval. And varieties that don't achieve full approval in 2 years will be removed by the MBC, and then will drop off the RL list. I guess there might be some allowances for COVID with that, but there's nothing official at the moment. The MBC has the right not to approve varieties for commercial as well as technical reasons, or remove them from the list. So it's not just that they have to have the qualities for brewing; they need to be commercially successful as well. And that's pretty much how varieties get added to the recommended list. If you want to know more, you can see in some detail how we do that. If you go into the AHD website, into the R part, you can see our crop committee handbook. That's an 80-page odd document that details how the varieties are selected, how the trials are run, how the committees work, and you can also see all the protocols there for all the trials, how all the trials are run. So if you're really very interested in how the recommended list system works, all that information is publicly available. So that's how it works. It does have some challenges, and it does have some limitations. And I want to spend the next few minutes just talking through some of those challenges and limitations that we have. So one thing we suffer from, I guess you could say, is pressure. The recommended list is a very high-profile program within the industry, and because of that, people are always looking for it to do more and to do what it does faster. And we like to keep it moving forward. And in 2018, we did a very large survey of the whole of the industry, from growers right through to processors. And we asked them a number of questions about what they wanted from the RL. And the chart on this slide shows the responses from growers. It was selected out the growers for this one. And we had 321 growers, so it's a pretty good response rate. And I want to focus first of all on the chart, on the bar in the middle, and the one just to the right of that. We often get criticised, or the RL often gets criticised for having too many varieties on it, too much choice, too much data, particularly the wheat list, which has a lot of varieties, but I guess the winter barley list potentially, and also the oilseed rape list. So we asked the question, do you want more varieties on the recommended list, or do you want fewer? I should point out just a moment, this is responses for all crops, not just for barley. But in the answer to that, of growers said they wanted fewer varieties. Okay, that kind of fits, but 18% said they wanted more varieties. So make that of that what you will. We have the system, and it looks like there's some people want more, some people want less. If we move to the two bars on the left-hand side, the one on the far left, nearly 60% wanted more economic potential information. Well, that's a really difficult one for us to do in the RL. It's a bit like the fungicides question, or what system are you in? How are you growing the crop? What's your end market? Without answering those sort of questions, it's impossible to put any sort of meaningful economic value on the RL. Yes, we could produce some numbers, but they would be of no use to anyone because they wouldn't match anyone's system. So it's something that we do get asked a lot. It's very, very difficult to do. And at the moment, there are no plans to try and provide economic output. Another area we get often asked on is regional information. People want more regional information. They want to know how their local trials are doing because people feel that they must have the information in their local region for it to be relevant. Again, that's a tricky one. Yes, we can provide more regional information and smaller regions, but as you get to smaller and smaller regions, you get fewer trials, and so the data becomes more and more unreliable. It's something we are looking at, and I'll mention a little bit more about that later on. Finally, the bar on the right-hand side, where we gave the option in this questionnaire for people to say they wanted something else more from the RL, and 34% said they did want something else. And we gave the option of saying what that something else was. And I've just picked out a few of the something else. Some of these got repeated over and over again. Some of them are unique, with a head scratch. But I thought I'd just go through them because I say many of these come up time and time again. So nutrient scavenging, or sometimes it's nitrogen use efficiency that people talk about. Very difficult to do. The trials for things like nitrogen use efficiency are tricky. We've only got a certain amount of budget, and we have discussed this at length in the RL board. And the feeling very much from the breeder side is that actually yield is a very good indicator of nitrogen use efficiency because, of course, all the varieties are grown on the same yield, on the same nitrogen regime. So actually, we've got a very good proxy for nitrogen use efficiency indeed from actually just yields. More resistant varieties, it's a slightly ambiguous quote, but we are trying to produce more ratings for different diseases where we can, but again, we're limited by resources. Direct drill versus plough versus min-till. This again is something that comes up quite a lot, and work has been done in Scotland on this on barley, and there are certainly some varieties that do better in a direct drill situation. Again, our problem with this is resources. I'd love to have another £500,000 a year to spend doing extra trials, and it's not just a case of sticking a direct drill into a field where previous year it was ploughed. It's also about if we're going to do these sorts of trials in a meaningful way, we need to have established direct drill systems that we can do trials on, and there are technical issues in terms of drills and things, plot drills. So that's something we'd love to be able to do. We are thinking about how we might be able to provide some information on that, but it's certainly not straightforward. Varieties that can be grown at a lower cost. This is an interesting one. Yes, grow varieties at a lower cost. There was actually a specialist category introduced to wheat a few years ago, which was known as cheap to grow varieties. The problem with that was no one really knew what it meant. There was only one variety ever recommended as a cheap to grow variety, and so it very quickly disappeared. Resilience, I guess robustness to adversity is kind of the same thing there. Resilience is something that people want. They want varieties which are going to do well in a good year and do well in a bad year, and not swing from bad to good from one year to another. It is something we've looked at with using the data we've got. The problem with that is, first of all, what actually does resilience mean? There are different definitions in the literature. Different people have slightly different ideas of what resilience means. And the problem is, you need quite a number of years of data to get a good handle on resilience. A couple of years of data doesn't really help you very much. So I say it's something we have looked at in some detail, but it's something that we really can't see an easy way of producing information on that. Though we do have some very basic information now on our variety selection tools on the website. Straw yield, yeah, we could do straw yield. It wouldn't cost that much more. We could do that. Drought tolerance. Drought tolerance is one of those things that tend to come and go depending on whether we've had a dry year or wet year. The problem with drought tolerance is when are we talking about drought? We're talking about drought in March, drought in April, drought in May. Again, it's something that's pretty tricky to do. And you have to have a number of years of data before you start to pick up drought information. We have looked at it again with the data after dry years, but it's very difficult to pick any clear patterns out. Vigor in spring, vigor in drilling. Vigor is one of those things which we do get asked about a lot. We are actually doing some work on oilseed rape. Vigor, it's proving to be challenging. Vigor isn't very well defined. It's a bit like resilience. It means different things to different people, and we're struggling to develop protocols which trial operators can do at a reasonable cost, and also that we can differentiate between varieties. So again, a tricky one to do. Brackling in winter barley. I'm pleased to be able to say we've done one of these. We have introduced brackling ratings for winter barley, so we can at least tick one of these off. Cleaner varieties with lower yields. I put that along because I thought it was a slightly curious request. I thought people want cleaner varieties with high yields, but as I say, it's not always easy to know what levy payers are really looking for. I've already mentioned robustness to adversity. Tillering ability, again, it's something we could probably do. It just requires more money. And finally, performance in mixtures. I mean, obviously, not possible if you're growing malting varieties, or effectively impossible. I'm quite a fan of mixtures in feed varieties, not so much the sort of populations which have become popular in some areas in wheat, but more variety mixtures. I think there probably is a future in variety mixtures if we can get the end users to accept them. I think there are a lot of advantages there. Whether we can do much testing in RL systems, because obviously the obvious question is, well, what mixture do you test? So there's some of the challenges coming from the end users, from the growers. There's also a challenge in the malting sector for us, and that's fragmentation of the market. We're now starting to see really quite a lot of different specialist types entering the market. Nil-lox varieties, low or no GN winter barley, 6-row malting barley varieties starting to come into the market. Please don't ask me at the end what any of those technical things mean. I'm afraid I can't help you with that. But these types of varieties are starting to enter the market. And it's difficult for the RL to know how to deal with them. Some of them are associated with lower yield, so they miss the yield targets by a long way. So they have to have some compensating features to get recommended. It's certainly the case that the markets are uncertain. Some of these will be grown exclusively on contract. Some of them won't be, and we have to ask the question: do we really want to recommend varieties for people to grow if we don't think there's a market for them in the end, even if they look like a good variety? There's also uncertainty in the testing regime that's required. I'm talking about the micro-malting testing. Because these varieties behave differently in a commercial situation, for us to micro-malt them and get a good understanding of their potential, micro-malt them appropriately, we need to have different regimes. In some cases, those different regimes haven't actually been established in a micro-malting situation. And actually, if we start to have a lot of different micro-malting regimes, that's going to push costs up for everybody. So the question is, should we actually be recommending these sorts of varieties at all, or should we just leave it to the market to bring these varieties through on contracts only. It's a question we're still grappling with. And we have some limitations to the RL, what it can do. I like to say it's the start of variety choice, not the end. It's a pool of data, and then it's up to the grower, the agronomist, and indeed the agronomy company to take that information and look at how those varieties are going to perform in a commercial situation. It's certainly not the end of variety selection, because the RL cannot test everything everywhere, and it never will be able to. And indeed, it doesn't set out to do that. We also have to be careful that we don't diverge too much from the national list, because the RL relies very heavily on the national list data. The first 2 years of testing is all done on the national list, and if we couldn't put the two data sets together, we couldn't run the RL as we do. We also need to recognise that it's a partnership between 4 parties, and we need to meet the needs of all the parties that contribute to the RL. It's not just about satisfying one set of levy payers. It's also very public, as I said earlier on. So if we change something, we need to get it right if we're going to maintain grower confidence. What we can't be doing is chopping and changing from one year to the next, because people will lose confidence in the system. And it's very influential. It has a huge impact on the varieties that are grown. And so if we need to change something, we need to get it right to avoid being sued. And that's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek comment, but the RL has been threatened with a legal action in the distant past. I'm informed if we make poor decisions, particularly if we undermine varieties without good data to back it up, we do risk that outcome. So where next with the recommended list? Well, we are limited in what we can do, as I've already said. One thing that did come out of that survey we did in 2018 was a ask for more digital access to the RL, and something we've done quite a lot on that. So we developed the RL app. I'm assuming you've all got it on your phone. If not, then please download it, because I have download targets as part of the RL system. It's free. Go to Apple and Google Play, so please download it. It's actually very useful. It's designed to replace our old pocketbooks. I use it a lot because it has the candidates on there, and the candidate data is updated regularly. And so if you want the latest information on the candidates, the RL app is the best place to get it. We've also developed a number of variety selection tools for all. At the start, the RL does sometimes get criticised for having too many varieties and too much data. Well, the variety tools are designed to get around that. They allow you to filter and select varieties based on all the different traits you want and the categories of those traits, so you can pick different levels of disease resistance, quality, all sorts of things, and filter down to a small number of varieties. And they're very useful. They do take a little bit of getting used to, because there are lots of different options on those, but people that spend a little bit of time working on do find them very useful, and they're very popular. We will see more tools coming forward. That's part of the HDB sort of move, is to move more into digital, and that's partly driven by economics, partly driven by end user requirements. But for the moment, don't worry, the RL booklet, the main booklet, will be remaining. It also proved to be extremely popular in our survey from 2018. We are trying to make better use of the data we've got. That's a cheap way of ensuring the RL keeps moving forward and keeps providing value. So we continue to review the methods that we're doing. Last year we had a fairly fundamental change in the way we calculate the oilseed rape. The winter wheat rust ratings. We also changed the oat mildew ratings. We're probably going to see a change in the way the lodging ratings are calculated this year. So we are always reviewing the methods we use. We're also investigating some new statistical techniques, which may allow us to produce better regional data. We have statistical consultants. We've also been working with other people in the industry, and we'll see where that gets us to. There may be better ways of analysing data to produce more robust outputs. Other areas you might see new traits. I'd love to be able to produce net blotch ratings for spring barley with quite enough data. we'd like to be able to have some more trials so we can do that. Unfortunately, the budget is fairly constrained at the moment, but that's something we might like to do. And I'd also like to open more trials to viewers. I said growers very much like to see their local trials and know how varieties are doing locally. Again, I'd like to be able to open more trials for local people to see. It's a case of whether we can do that logistically. So in summary, the RL is the key source of variety information for UK growers and agronomists. We had an external consultant come in and do an evaluation of the RL in 2019, and they focused on agronomists, and the agronomists said that the RL was more important than all the other sources of information on varieties put together. So for the moment, at least, it remains the key source of variety information. Its key selling point is independence. We're not selling seed, we're not selling chemistry, we're just providing information. It has a long history, and that gives it a strong place in the industry and gives people confidence in it. And it is continually evolving to try and meet the needs of its growers and indeed the whole supply chain right through to the end users. But you have to remember, I'm afraid it can't do everything. So just a couple of acknowledgements before I finish. Obviously, I manage the RL, but there's a big team that sits behind me. We have the technical field team, who I mentioned, are out today viewing and validating trials. Mark, Sean, and Sarah Jane. They're all very capable, know a lot about varieties. If you want to know detail about varieties and how they're performing around the country, they're the people to speak to. Catherine Harries. Catherine Harries is a diseases specialist. If you have questions about diseases, Catherine will be the person to speak to, and she produces all the disease ratings for us. Then we've got the data team, Ellie, Pat, and Diane. They're responsible for crunching all the numbers, producing all the tables for the committees, and Ellie leads on the development of that side of the RL. And of course, BSPB, MAGB, and UK flour millers, who put a huge amount of in-kind into the RL. About 50% of that £5 million a year comes from those three. So that is all from me, George. I will stop sharing. George, you're muted. George, you're still muted.
Is that it this time?
That's it. Good.
Yep, good. Thank you very much, Paul. As you know, that farmers out there treat the RL as the Bible, and we keep it at our desk. I've got a drawer full of the handbooks and the RL lists there, and use it regularly when looking at variety selection and things like that. So it's good to hear just how this all works. Paul, we have 7 questions lodged already. So we've got a good set of questions ready. So I'll just go to the first question. It was Robbie. And Robbie, you asked, what are the current situations regarding the use of DNA-based variations for assessing the distinctiveness and uniformity? Paul, do you want to pick up that question?
Yeah, I mean, that's national list rather than recommended list. That's not really our territory. I know that there has been quite a lot of discussion about whether we should move to a sort of marker-based system of DUS testing rather than the current sort of testing system. I suspect it's a question of having to turn the super tanker, and may well be some issues of funding for that. But I say that falls in the national list territory rather than RL territory. But it would seem to be a sensible way forward.
Robbie, do you want to come back on that?
Well, I mean, the question was really based on the field trials we had at Arable Scotland last year, where, to be honest, I couldn't tell the difference between any of the new barley varieties just by looking at them on the surface. And I'm sure it takes some real expertise to identify some of the traits that are used in DUS testing currently to differentiate between different varieties. And, you know, molecular markers, for example, are a straightforward and easy approach to do that and get a definitive result.
Yeah, as I say, I think it will probably come at some point, I would imagine.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Robbie. Our next question is Adrian, and Adrian, this is one that is very constantly asked, and it's about considering rarely reflects conditions rarely reflect trial conditions, and therefore the RL system can overemphasize potential yield. How well suited is the trial system to the net zero production agenda and real farm growing conditions, and how can it be better adapted?
Yeah, I mean, we do recognise that any trialling system is going to be quite different to a commercial situation. Just about the nature of the way a trial is run, will mean you're always going to get higher yields than you will in your average commercial situation. Although I think the best commercial growers will match trial yields. The net zero is an interesting one. We are starting to get feedback from the distilling industry. They're very much moving or thinking about how to move towards net zero, and that's starting to think about things like nitrogen use efficiency. As I said, we have quite a long debate about nitrogen use efficiency at the RL board earlier in the year. The feedback from the breeders was that the breeders across Europe have spent many millions of euros and pounds trying to track down the genetic basis of nitrogen use efficiency and got precisely nowhere with that. It's something that we could, if we were to trial, it would be very expensive. Nitrogen utilization trialing is quite tricky to do. And the general feeling of that meeting was that yield is the best indicator of nitrogen use efficiency. But how we achieve net zero, it's going to be very difficult. And as I also mentioned, moving the trials more towards sort of min-till, zero-till. If we see that becoming the dominant form of cultivation, then the trial system would have to move with it. We are looking at the moment, we don't actually collect information on how the trials are, the primary cultivation of the trials. We are going to do that from now on, so we may be able to then pick out patterns within the trial results depending on how the trials were cultivated. So we are starting to move in that area, but they're tricky areas to move into.
Paul, do you want to explain a wee bit about the untreated yields as well? Because I think that's important when it comes to farmer selection, that farmers are looking at the untreated yields as well to see, and I think that maybe addresses a wee bit of Adrian's question as well. Do you want to speak a wee bit about that?
Yes, I mean, I think in the past the untreated trials have not paid that much attention to. Farmers are starting to look more and more at those untreated yields, and we've just gone through a procurement process where we've trials for the next 5 years, and we have put more untreated trials into that data set because we recognise that those untreated yields are increasingly what the farmers are starting to look at. So we are doing more on that untreated side.
Okay, thank you very much.
Can I just say at the end of my question, I also highlighted the agronomic merit tool, and I think that probably helps address some of these issues. And I wonder whether that could be promoted and developed much more, because I see that as potentially of great value.
Yes, the agronomic merit tool is part of the variety selection tool. It's a new concept, which it could potentially move into the main RL. The value of having it in the variety selection tool is you can shift the importance of the different characteristics. So if you're in the north, then Rhynchosporium is going to be more important than if you're in the east, growing a barley variety in East Anglia. So you can shift those around, and that affects the agronomic merit of varieties. Whereas if we did it in the RL booklet, then it has to be fixed for a certain situation, which wouldn't suit half the people looking at it.
Okay, thank you very much. We've got another question from Robbie, and it's about the data that we have, Paul, and the access to the mountain of trial data you have for several crops across sites and season for scientific discovery projects. Is it free for use for scientific community, and how far back in time do the records go? And is there any metadata associated with each of the trials?
So there are different levels of access to the data. So obviously, anything that's in the recommended list booklet on the recommended list itself is perfectly free to see. You can also sign up and view individual trial results from our host results service. So that's on the recommended list website, and you can sign up to receive emails and that every year as the trial results come in. But that only shows you the varieties which are either RL varieties or candidates. If you want to get access to all the varieties, so that's and also to individual plot data, the full range of metadata, and the trials which haven't necessarily been validated, you can get access to that data. You have to go through, you have to email and ask for it, and it has to go through a system where the breeders have a veto on releasing data which isn't already in the public domain. Generally speaking, that they will allow data to be released for research purposes. It might depend a little bit on what research you were doing, and they sometimes put caveats around where you can release the results to. But generally speaking, the data does go back quite a long way, and you can get quite a lot of data for research purposes.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. My next question in the chat box is just a number, so sorry I can't identify the question setter. But Paul, what is the RL definition of light and heavy soil, and what percentage of UK arable soils do you think are in each category?
So the soil categorisations are taken from the English, I'm afraid, RB2 and 9, the DEFRA categories. So it's I can't remember exactly where they fall. There are 5 categories in RB2 and 9, and we picked the lower and the higher. I mean, the trials we try to locate them on soil types that are appropriate to the region. So when we're procuring trials, so for instance, in East Anglia, we'll have trials on heavy soils because that's a common soil type in places like Essex, through Cambridgeshire. In Scotland, a lot of trials are on light soils because obviously up in Scotland you have a lot more light soils than we need down in England. So we do try to spread the trials around to reflect the sort of the spread of spread of soil types in the regions as best we can.
Paul, do you just want to touch on the Met data that we have for each site as well, the Met stations that we have on each site as well?
Yeah, so we used to have Met stations on the site. That became prohibitively expensive, not least because trial operators tend to run over them with sprayers and things like that. We now get data from various different sources and use that to produce. I'm not sure what the technical term is, but basically interpolate between the actual weather stations to produce. We can produce on-site data, so it's quite a sophisticated system. So we can produce metadata for our trial sites, but not directly from our own trial weather stations anymore.
Okay, my next question, Paul, is from Richard, and it is respraying regimes and trials. Does the fungicide type depend on seasonal prevalence or disease encountered, or do the available fungicides have a broad enough spectrum to control everything?
So we review the fungicide protocol every year. It's designed to control the full range of diseases. We do specify the products which control operators should use. They are given leeway in terms of dose, so they're appropriate to their situation, and there are some options within there that they can take up if disease pressure is high, or they can leave out if disease pressure is low. So we set a general fungicide program, which is pretty intense, but then there are options around there that the trial operators can use or not, depending on the situation they find themselves in.
Okay, and next one is from Malcolm, and I do apologise for the pronunciation, but what level of hectorology is acceptable in an RL line? Hectogenealogy. Durability. Sorry.
Heterogeneity.
Sorry,
Heterogeneity.
Robbie.
Heterogeneity.
Heterogeneity. Thank you very much, Robbie.
Thanks, Joe. I think I'm going to have to pass on that one. I can maybe get back to you. I mean, we don't measure that. I guess it would come from. I would imagine that sort of thing is measured in the national list system, and then anything that we only test things that have come through the national list system. So I would imagine that is tested in the national list, but certainly it's not something we do.
Does Malcolm want to come back on that one?
I was just wondering, in terms of, sometimes when you look at a field of barley, you can see the levels of, different lines that are present. You get a uniform kind of level of one variety, and you can see there are definitely different varieties across the field. So it's difficult to measure, I guess, unless you're doing some kind of genetic analysis.
Yeah, I mean, the seed for the RL trials comes from direct from the breeders, so it will be even the variety direct breeders. So you would imagine that's a fairly high purity, I believe, and somebody might be able to correct me on this. That certified seed has to have a 90% level of purity. I'm not certain on that one. That's commercial seed, obviously, so you'd expect seed from the breeders to be higher than that. But obviously, the more a crop is growing, the more you're going to get volunteers coming in it. And we do actually stop trials if they've got too many volunteers in them. I was actually in a barley trial last week and it was full of wheat volunteers, so obviously that one had to stop.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to this, as a variety keeps going on, it sometimes falls back to trait of one of the parents. So sometimes you get these 3 or 4 different types growing within the crop, and it's no, it's fine getting year 1 seed, but as the seed multiplied up and up 2 or 3 times, sometimes you can get it going back to parent trait. We've seen that in varieties before. So yeah, we just yeah. Okay, James Worth is the next one. As a breeder, getting approval of RL gives you the ticket to sell, but we often know that varieties' sustainability and on-farm performance are very different. Is there any thinking to reduce inputs to be little more in line with what being used on farm rather than the high level currently used? I think that's a high level used within the trials.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of fertilizer inputs, the trials will be run on a pretty standard sort of farm fertilizer regime. The PGR and the fungicides, yeah, I mean, I've already said a little bit about this. It's about trying to look at what the variety will do in a very well controlled disease situation. There has been talk of doing a sort of extra trials with something like a farm commercial fungicide program, but as I said before, it's what one person's commercial program is somebody's ridiculously high program or ridiculously low program. So it's difficult to know where you'd land it.
Okay. Okay, James, do you want to come back on that one? No, sorry, I don't think James is with us any longer. Okay, right, we move to the last question I've got on the screen, and it's from Ian Palmer. As a distiller, we have found that RL gets in the way of using different varieties. We use winter barley and 6-row barleys. Low carbon footprint barley is a key selection for us. I think the RL needs to keep more varieties available and to begin to take into account low carbon footprint.
I mean, as I said right at the, I don't know if I said right at the start or not, a farmer can grow any variety on the national list. It doesn't have to be on the recommended list. I mean, look at a variety like Maris Otter, introduced in 1965, and I think it still takes about 5% of the barley area in England. And there are varieties like Westminster and Wagon that are still grown fairly extensively. the RL does have to it does focus very much on the newer varieties, and if we kept people complaining it's too long already, if we kept more of those old varieties on, it would be even longer. In terms of moving to that sort of net zero position and 6-row malting and those kind of varieties, and as I said, that we are looking at how we can incorporate those. We did have some 6-row malting varieties come through the system last year, and but they failed the micro malting tests. But we don't believe, and the malting barley committee don't think that those micro malting tests really suit those 6 rows. So it's understanding how we bring these 6 rows through the system, not just the RL system, but also the MBC system, so they can get approval by MAGB. So these are areas we're looking at. Sometimes the RL does move quite slowly. One disadvantage of having 4 partners is you have to get everyone in line to move forward, which can be a bit frustrating at times. But it does mean the system is robust when it does move.
I think just to back up what Paul's saying, the RL is very much letting farmers see what the new varieties are out there and their traits, but actually the market dictates what you grow. My example is when I was farming, I grew Moraisi and grew Moraisi for a lot longer than it was even on. We had to actually buy the seed rights to continue using it so that we could actually repopulate the seed. But that's what the market wanted. There was a certain maltster in Scotland that wanted Moraisi, so we kept growing it. So the market dictates quite highly. The RL is a guide, but if what the market's looking for is not on the RL, the farmer will go and grow that for the marketplace as well. So I think that's quite a good one just to sum up on. We've had an excellent selection of questions there. I had one question just I wanted to put to Paul just to finish off, and do the breeders have too much power in the system?
Obviously, I'm going to say no. I think we have to recognise the breeders put an awful lot into the system. As I said, they provide us with that national list data. It's not public data, but they allow us to pick which bits we see. We see the whole lot, and we decide which is valid and which is not. And without that data, we wouldn't be able to run the RL like we do, or it costs us an awful lot more money to do. In terms of actually running the RL, the breeders, they do have representatives that sit on the committee, but they don't vote on varieties. And I think it's also worth noting that the breeders are not they don't act it all together. They have different portfolios of varieties with different characteristics, and they'll very often come to different conclusions on points about variety characteristics and how we should measure them. So very often they'll be arguing amongst themselves about which direction we should go. So yes, the breeders play an important part, but I don't think they do have too much power, and they certainly contribute an awful lot towards the RL.
Good. Paul, thank you very much for your input this afternoon. It has really been very good insight into AHDB's work with the RL and also a bit on the NL as well. And as you know, variety selection is becoming more and more important for the farmer. So as long as AHDB can continue this work with the help of the scientific community as well, I think we're moving forward in the right way. A couple of times carbon zero barley has been brought up, and that's actually quite a nice intro into what we're trying to do in the International Barley Hub, where we actually have set up a subgroup to look at producing zero barley. So we haven't had our first meeting yet. We've got the group set up, but we haven't had our first meeting yet. That will happen within the next fortnight to 3 weeks, and this is looking at how can we produce carbon zero barley. So I think it's very timely that a couple of times this has been mentioned today. But yes, the Barley Hub will be looking at, International Barley Hub will be looking at this. So please, if you have any input into that, please get in touch with Donna or Robbie, because we'd really look forward to your thoughts on how we could maybe help achieve this. We do realise it's very, very important. Paul, could you pull up the last slide, please? So, so as I said at the very beginning, this is the third. Oh, you're way back. You're on to fan benchmarking now, Paul. That's it. Oh, no, that's it. Good. Okay. As I said at the very beginning, this is the third of the seminars that we've got. Our next seminar is on the 22nd of July. I do believe the ticket sales have now opened. They opened at 3 o'clock this afternoon, and that's the 22nd of July at 2 p.m. And it is the barley quality for malting and malt quality required for brewing and distilling. So this is going to be, the speaker is going to be David Griggs from Chris Malt, and our chairman is going to be Julian South from MEGB. So all I can do now is thank you very much for your attendance. If you haven't registered, if it's the first time you've been on the site and been on one of the webinars and you would like to join us or even be one of our stakeholders, please register with Donna, and we will make sure you're on the mailing list. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you on future seminars. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks, George. Thanks,
Thank
Paul.
you.
Thanks, Zoe.